Deep sea divers. What are your horror stories? I wear contacts, so getting water in my mask is extra bad, as I can't open my eyes underwater. Shortly after being told about a shark colliding with my friend from behind and removing his mask, I'm pretty scared about this, and I see a shark heading my way. They're curious creatures. They often shoulder bump you as they turn at the last second, but she wasn't changing course. I stayed calm and still as long as I could, and at the last second, before she hit my mask, I ducked. Except instead of ducking under, I just headbutted her right in the nose. Everyone saw and thinks it was the funniest thing ever. I may be the only person alive who headbutted an 11-foot shark in the nose, but it was because I was scared she would take my goggles off. I was diving in a local pond with a group of much more advanced divers than I. I'm leading the dive to get used to the pressures and responsibilities of heading the procession. They're mentoring me. It's a Texas puddle. Visibility 10 feet max. Not too deep, maybe 25 feet. The known horrible visibility makes it impossible to navigate by compass. We follow a line put by other divers. These lines go from one sunken item to another. So I know I'm about to hit a small sunken boat. Don't remember which one. There are a few similar in a row, in the same state of decay. So, I'm first in the group, I get to the boat and see someone else's black army boot sticking out from the inner quarters. Curious thing is, it looks somewhat new, not like items you'd find on the bottom. Hard to see, too much muck in the water. So I touch the boot, thinking it's by itself, but it won't lift, like it's attached to something heavy. I put my hand further in and feel the leg continuing out. Then pants, the calf, and I see the second leg now. Fuck, with a big letter F, right? I turn around and show a sign for the emergency ascent to the group behind me. Everyone has a sour face, no one wants to surface, but it's a rule that if one says up, others in a group must abort, no questions. They wanted me to explain with signs why, but what's a diver's sign for a cadaver? I feel like I rushed toward the surface, even though I was trying to stay calm and take my time. So we're on the lake's surface, I have this massive adrenaline rush, and I can't breathe enough. I tell them there's a body down there. I see rolling eyes from everyone as soon as they see I'm serious. What a fun bunch, right? So I describe in detail what I saw. We go down. I don't lead anymore. We make a group search pattern for the line, but once we locate it, we don't know if we should go forward or backwards, as there are a number of boats on the line and who knows in which one the body is, and how far we drifted while talking it out on the surface. Well, we find all the boats before finding the original one, of course. So our customary leader goes into the cabin of the boat and we wait. I'd say he was rather courageous at this point, went right in. Then he emerges from the cloud of muck and tells us all to surface. So, gluing information together from what we learned later on, turns out the police or some other agency had a body recovery training program in the same lake on the same day. When they went for lunch, they stuffed their fully dressed, anatomically correct rubber doll in one of the sunken boats for a few hours for safekeeping. I died a little bit that day. I dive a lot, several times a week in fact. My area has a lot of theoretically dangerous things. Sharks and barracudas, morays and stingrays, blue-ringed octopuses, cone snails, box jellies, siphonophores of all kinds, sea snakes, stonefishes and scorpion fishes, venomous catfish, crown-of-thorns starfish, and various sea urchins that can hurt you in several different ways, titan triggerfish, and so on and so on. But only one thing has ever got me. Twice, actually. Are you ready? Clownfish. Like Nemo. They are territorial and brave and will get in your face if you're near their anemones. I usually respect their space, but I was distracted watching something else a couple of times, and turns out they will actually bite you if you don't leave their space fast enough. For real though, I don't have particular horror stories. But the scariest moments are probably when I get caught in strong currents and have to crawl on the bottom to fight it, going hand over hand like I'm climbing a horizontal wall. Despite what a lot of people tend to think, especially looking at the daunting list of dangerous animals in my area, sea critters aren't your problem. You leave them alone and it's fine. Sea conditions like waves or currents, and above all, human error, are the real killers. Diving at Gordon's Rock in the Galapagos. We had hoped to see hammerhead sharks that frequent the area. This is a pinnacle surrounded by deep water and strong currents. Our guide had us hold on to the rocks and wait to see who came by. While we were waiting, a group of 10 reef sharks were circling above us while 2 lager moray eels were popping their heads out a few feet away, opening their mouths, letting us know they mean business. Needless to say, I was a bit nervous and burning through my air at a rapid rate. Suddenly, a group of a dozen hammerhead sharks came into view. We hadn't really discussed what we would do. The guide motioned for us to follow, and the next thing I know, we're swimming with the school of sharks. This only lasted a few minutes before they broke away from the group. We began to move into our safety stop zone where currents were pushing us in different directions, when suddenly I ran out of air. You don't get much warning when suddenly there's nothing left. So here I am, 15 feet or so underwater, unable to reach my partner's secondary air, being forced to surface when I should still be chillin'. At least the second time I ran out of air was user error on my wife's part, anniversary dive, and I was able to get the secondary air and get back to the surface safely. Oh, and then there was the time diving Bloody Bay Wall in the Caymans, where there is a 5,000-foot drop, and my partner was narked out and kept going deeper, nearly exceeding the recreational limit of 120 feet or so. If I hadn't grabbed her, she might still slowly be falling into the abyss. Diving is super fun. I was on a night dive on the Great Barrier Reef with my partner who was still learning to dive, myself with about 10 years of diving experience, and a dive master. First night dive ever for my partner, who had been hearing from the two of us about how incredible it is. Night diving is one of those amazing, life-changing experiences, completely different to daytime diving as the sights and sounds of the reef are radically different. Plus, viewing the reef through just the small areas of light from your torches change how you process the experience. It's exhilarating and incredibly zen at the same time. As we're circling back to the boat, the sharks, who have been standoffish but curious, as they usually are, come in, and one has an inquisitive bite at the dive master's fins. Never seen or heard of sharks getting this aggressive with divers, so the three of us damn near catapulted ourselves out of the water and cut the dive short. Have never been worried about sharks while diving until that moment. Normally, they're more afraid of you than you are of them, but not this time. This one scared the shit out of me for a second. My dive buddy and I were setting up at this old flooded quarry that's become a popular dive spot. The company that owns it has set up a bunch of floating platforms, which are suspended underwater by ropes tying them to buoys on the surface. Each of these buoys is rated to hold over 100 pounds. Remember that. So we've geared up, walked into the water, and done our final checks when something a little further out in the distance grabs both of our attention. It's hard to explain what it was. Maybe a slight sound, maybe a ripple in the water. But it felt wrong enough that suddenly we were both looking the same way at the same pair of buoys just offshore. And almost as soon as we set our eyes on them, one of the buoys snapped below the surface. What the fuck? My dive buddy said it, but I was thinking it too. The buoys were pretty hefty pieces of equipment, and one had just gotten pulled under the water like a bath toy, in a quarry where the biggest fish were a handful of trout. Something was off. Of course, the what the fuck factor ratcheted up a couple notches when the buoy returned, forcefully. The damn thing shot out of the water easily 6 feet into the air before landing with a hard slap that reverberated out over the otherwise calm water of the quarry. My dive buddy and I made eye contact, and pretty much instantly we knew our dive plan had changed. We were checking that shit out. Swimming down into the cold quarry water, I couldn't help but notice this was exactly the kind of thing that got people killed in horror movies. Here we were, alone in the murky water, our visibility topping out at maybe 10 feet. As we moved forwards, I couldn't shake the feeling that anything could be right in front of us, just waiting to break through the gloom. Even while my rational brain reminded me that there couldn't possibly be anything down there, my older reptile brain kept on replaying the sight of the buoy sharply dipping below the surface. Yes, for those of you wondering, you can still sweat nervously underwater. As soon as we got to the platform, now sticking halfway out of the muddy quarry floor, the non-horror movie truth was pretty quickly evident. One of the two ropes attaching the buoys to the platform had snapped, and the remaining buoy alone wasn't strong enough to hold the weight. It had been pulled over, but still fighting hard to return to the surface. At some point during the platform's descent, Buoyancy won the fight against gravity, and the trapped buoy broke free from its tie as well, sending it rocketing back above the surface. At the end of the day, it was totally logical. I still blame Cthulhu, though. I went cave diving once, and I'll never go again. This cave was basically a pool the size of someone's backyard swimming pool, and then a loop that was 100% submerged. Once you started the dive, you had to finish it. If shit goes sideways, there is no surface or air. Dive took about an hour to complete, whole hour for things to go wrong. I remember at one point it was really narrow, and I noticed my stomach was almost touching the bottom, so I adjusted ever so slightly upward. My fucking tank hit the ceiling and bounced me into the ground, and I realized just how tiny the space I was in was. I probably had 6 inches around me maximum, and my mind just kinda went blank. I spent the rest of the dive focusing on breathing and not shitting myself. I love diving. With all of my heart. I've been to Indonesia, Thailand, Mexico, etc. I've done everything from muck dives in shallow water looking for cuttlefish, to wall dives, to snorkeling in the Galapagos and Cabo. I've even dived in open water with whale sharks or schools of hammerheads. But fuck me, I will never go cave diving again. This is my brother's story, not mine. He's very experienced, over 1,000 dives. This day, he was about 40 meters down, diving a reef he'd dived many other times before, looking for crayfish or maybe a fish to spear. Visibility is low at 3 to 4 meters. He has 3 mates with him, but they've moved to the other side of the rocky spur he's exploring. So he's facing the rock with his hand exploring the crevices for crays, when suddenly something hits him from behind and pushes him into the rock hard enough to knock the breath out of him, and hold him so hard he can't move. He's held like this for a few seconds, and then the pressure releases. He thinks his mates are messing with him, so he turns around expecting to see another diver. But there's nothing there. A diver wouldn't have been able to get away fast enough to avoid being seen in the gloom, so he swims over the spur to see his 3 mates exploring the reef. So now he's getting seriously worried. He signals to his mates to ascend, and they return to the dive boat. When he takes his tank off, there's a new gouge in the metal about 1 millimeter deep and wrapping about 1/4 of the way around the tank. He thinks somewhere out in the deep, a big shark was hunting him, and he never even saw it. I spent a few years diving for the Navy. I've done some pretty deep dives of all kinds, and did some underwater welding at one point, which I hated because it's hard to be attentive to everything as is, but when you throw welding into the equation, it's almost too much. The team I was on back in '96 did some time at the Zuckelli Station down at the southern pole. It was our home away from home whenever we were inland, and not usually off on one of our 1,000 miles away dives assisting with cable installs or repairs. Sometimes these jobs would take a few weeks or months to do, depending on what specifically we were doing, at what depths, who was involved, etc. The deepest we ever went was a little past 1,000 feet, and let me tell you, it's like a different damn planet at that depth, especially where we were. The place was a kind of cold you didn't know could exist. The gases you use could give you a headache, or they did with me sometimes at least, and the noises you hear are fucking unreal. The South Pole has way more life than you might think, too. I saw some pretty massive sharks. I caught a glimpse once of a 20+ foot long great white shark, which made me come close to pissing my pants. But I also saw a few squids that came close to making me have a heart attack, if it wasn't for how amazing they appeared at that size. They were as big as me, and I'm around 6'2" at about 230 pounds. There's tons of fish, jellies, crabs, and as weird as it might sound, there's some coral. Well, coral isn't the right word for it, I guess. Algae? Anemones? Whatever they are, it all looked like ghostly coral. Almost entirely transparent, usually about the size of a basketball. Anyway, the place we were working at one week was right next to a huge ridge that had a pretty deep drop-off that went even deeper than where we were, by about 1.2 thousand feet or so. The gorge was so huge, you couldn't even see the other side of it. It was like a massive void. I was on a team that went in to drill holes for a series of pylons that our group was installing for RAAF, and some of their contractors. They never really said what it was used for, but I think it had something to do with some of the research networking Zuck used, as one of the strands came from our base. There were only 3 of us that did the actual dive, with 2 on standby and everyone else in comms or ops, which might sound weird, but bear in mind that we have loaders and drilling stations on the job site, which make the work of many turn into the work of a few. The work itself wasn't exactly hard, but it wasn't safe by any stretch of the imagination. We always have heavy loads because of the suits and tanks, equipment, etc., but we had to operate the machinery we use to make the holes, which can sometimes be the hardest part, due to the loss of dexterity you suffer with all the gear and equipment draped all over your body. You had to keep a constant eye on the systems and gauges, sensors, temps, etc. to avoid problems, but if anything did happen, you had to scurry over to one of the danger stations for whatever you needed, after letting your safety partner know if possible to avoid machinery accidents. Believe it or not, we were pretty good, and never had any major issues, except once we had a drill shaft practically blow up into about 20 different pieces at once. Not sure what it hit, but once we swapped it out, we made it through whatever it was that caused the shaft to break. It wasn't a major issue, we just reloaded a different shaft, it happens. We had to swap it out again not long after though, because I think the bit had to crunch through the other bit that was still in the hole. So I guess I'll be one of the few on here who has an actual scary monster story. Because one night we were down there doing our thing, and one of the 20-foot tall job site lights we used to keep our area lighted was tipped over, and I'm not sure what did it. These things weigh about 250 pounds, and are operated like one of those one-man lifts or buggies that you step onto to control it, like a mini excavator you can rent from Home Depot. We were all operating the drill site when it happened, and the falling light was what caught our attention. By the time we saw it land on the seafloor, we had shut the drill off and stood motionless trying to gauge what happened, and just kind of listen for anything. I think we were all shocked, because none of us moved a muscle for a few minutes. After standing there, we were looking around trying to shine our helmet spotters toward the downed light pole area, and then we heard a noise. It came from the opposite area behind the still standing light poles over the gorge, and it was about 40 yards from our site, I think. It's really hard to gauge distance underwater, especially when you're freezing and you can't see anything past the lighting we had at that depth. I'll never forget what it sounded like too. If you go to YouTube and search for underwater slowdown noise, that's basically what it sounded like. I have no idea if that noise is what tipped over the pole, but after that, we never saw or heard anything like what happened, but we were still shook up over it. My buddy said he came close to dropping his weights. As soon as we were all topside, we told our captain what we saw and heard. He just laughed at us and said we needed to check our gases next time, but he stopped laughing once I showed him some captures of the tipped over light pole. As crazy as it sounds, I do miss doing that stuff. I have an extreme phobia of sharks. Like, you don't understand the extent of my fear. The shark in Madagascar scared the ever-living shit out of me. I can't see sharks in commercials, or even on small pictures in magazines. Shit, I can't even shower and close my eyes and think of a shark. It's that bad. Anyway, I was in Egypt with my dad when I was 15 years old, and we were diving with another group. But we wanted to do one last dive before heading home. They assured me no sharks would be there because of the season. Me and my dad go down and stay under for a good 20 to 30 minutes or so, and then he taps my shoulder and points to something in the distance. I turn towards it, and holy motherfucking shit, it is a big-ass shark. My dad doesn't believe in phobias, he's kind of an asshole, and I immediately panic, like full-blown tunnel vision hyperventilating panic. I do understand that you should never just ascend immediately, or you could possibly die. It felt like 2 hours, but it was only a few seconds. But when it swam towards us, I realized it was a black-spotted eagle ray. I don't know the exact name, but it was a big one. Just because of how it moved, I thought it was a shark at first. I managed to calm myself down, and I noped the fuck out of there as fast as possible. I've never dived in any waters that have sharks since, and I probably won't. They told me that they were 99.99% no sharks would show up, so I believed them. That's the only reason I went into that water. And to be fair, I guess they were right. My uncle used to scuba dive around Georgian Bay, Ontario, a lot. It used to be a very busy shipping area, so lots of wrecks from the late fall months. He liked collecting the old bottles and china cups and things like that. He wasn't a superstitious person at all, but sometimes he saw things that freaked him out. Here are a few of those stories. Once he was diving with his friend, and they went down to a passenger shipwreck. Huge boat, pretty old. His friend was super excited because it had the potential to have a fair bit of antique china around based on the nature of the ship. As they were getting closer to the bottom, my uncle noticed that the lake floor was looking a little hazy, almost like a fog was covering the area around the ship. It wasn't until he was a lot closer that he started freaking out. He was looking down at ghostly bodies and faces of hundreds of people who all died in the wreck. His friend couldn't see any of it, so he kept quiet for years about it. He saw a few ghostly faces a few more times diving in other spots too. One more for good measure. He had a bit of an obsession with the story of this one ship called the Wabuno. Rumor had it that the cargo ship went down near a place now called San Souci during a bad storm. Below the water near the shore on a nearby island, there's a visible piece of the hull of the wreck, and they have some history about it on a plaque. The rest of the wreck has never been found, which means the captain's safe is still at the bottom of the lake somewhere. My uncle wanted to find that captain's safe, so he started looking into the plotted course for its travel. Except then he noticed that where the piece of hull washed up close to the shore doesn't make sense, given the island shapes and plotted course and the supposed course of the storm that blew through. So he did some more research and found the original building plans of the ship, and figured out that the bolts in the supposed piece of the hull don't match those plans. So he plotted a list of about 15 different spots he figured the real wreck could be based on all the information he had, and he started diving one spot at a time. He was 4 or 5 spots from the end of his list, and as he was descending, he noticed that the lake floor seemed to be rippling and moving. As he got closer to the bottom, he saw that the whole bottom was covered in crayfish, so many that he couldn't see the actual ground below them. Crayfish are scavengers, so they only gather like that when there's something to eat, and a lot of it. He didn't even try to touch down, and went right up back to the surface. After a few more encounters with the faces of the dead at the bottom of the lake, he stopped diving, because he just couldn't deal with it mentally. His buddy went diving to one of the last spots on his Wabuno list a few years later, and found a porthole window matching the plans of the ship. So my uncle figured between that and the crayfish lake bed, he was pretty close to the real wreck. Not precisely the sea, because I live quite a ways away from it, but I did take a free diving course near Lake Eufaula a few years ago with my cousin. It was several hours of cross-country driving to get there, but we had time as I wasn't married yet. Technically, we should have gone for the absolute first course, but we were both idiots and decided to do an amateur course instead. The idea being is that you, along with a group of people and a mentor, take a pontoon boat, anchor it, then start diving with weights. The weights themselves were chained to the boat, so you could drop them as you went to control your buoyancy. It was a bit of a redneck setup, but we were deep in a rural area, so it metered out. The lake is quite large, winding up and down the state, so there was no shortage of out-of-the-way places with rather incredible depths to leap into. It's also basically mud brown all the way around. Your visibility is a couple feet in front of you, if you're lucky. We had the basics down pat. Ascend so many feet, stop and equalize, ascend some more, and so forth until you hit the surface. What we lacked was the experience to handle when things went wrong. And I'd never been below a shallow lake's bottom, so I was surprised at how quickly I began falling once I'd gotten to the point where the water went from mud brown to simply empty black. Just absolutely no buoyancy at all. My cousin and I stuck together, figuring we could hit the bottom, kick the mud a few times, and come back up. 20 or 30 seconds, right? No big deal. We had flashlights, and if we got lost, we'd just haul ourselves back up with the weight chains. Maybe we'd see an old car down here in the depths or something else neat. So we hit the mud, and my chest is pounding, and I realized way too late I might not be able to hold my breath as long as I could on the surface, which is when I feel a huge current push against our ankles, nearly toppling me. And one big bloody catfish fin sweeps by the swirling dirt cloud I could see with my light. My memory likely makes it bigger than it actually was, but I swear that thing was nearly as tall as I am. My cousin later confirmed that's about as big as he thought it was too. Great grandpa catfish. I blow all the air out of my lungs in surprise, and now I'm dragging myself up the chain as fast as I can go, with empty lungs and a head feeling like it's about to collapse, while my cousin is pushing on my rear end with his head, trying to climb past me. I don't go swimming, much less diving, in Lake Eufaula anymore. Even during the brief times I make the trip with my family to go camping, I can still remember the migraines and chest pain to this day. I'm a hard hat diver for the Navy. One of my first real working dives was changing out some zincs on a pipeline off the coast of Hawaii at about 130 feet. One of the benefits of wearing a helmet when you dive is the communication and the sense of security it gives you, kind of like armor. We also wear a bailout bottle on our back as a secondary air source. Well, we went down that morning, and when you're descending in the water in Hawaii, it's not uncommon to see some small to medium sharks moving around in the water column. As some of you know, sharks don't have fingers, so if they're curious about you, they either ram you or bite you. My friend told me to watch out for tiger sharks, because if one of those was in the area, it's very dangerous, as they are pretty aggressive. So we went to the bottom, and I'm working for about an hour, when I feel like I just got speared from behind by an NFL linebacker. I immediately thought shark, but in my mind I told myself to just close my eyes and pretend it didn't happen. Well, that didn't last more than a few seconds because I was shitting my pants. I turned around and scanned, and swimming off in the other direction was one of the biggest tiger sharks I have ever seen to this day. Still don't know for sure if that's what hit me, but I have a pretty good idea. I went recreational diving off the coast of Miami a few years ago. A friend offered to take us out on his boat. We were a few miles from Miami, I would guess 8 or so maybe, where you could still see the beaches, but far enough so that it doesn't really matter. There was, from what I recall, the footing of an oil rig or some other man-made item at the site we went to. 2 divers were going in first, while the rest of us hung out topside. We followed tons of really smart rules that helped us later, as we recorded what time they went in the water and had GPS coordinates for our location. Of course, we were anchored, but you never know. Well, it's a 60-foot dive, so 45-minute bottom time is typical. After 45 minutes, we started to keep an eye out. Nothing. At the hour mark, nothing. As time drew on, we got more and more paranoid, and the ocean plays tricks on you, almost like a mirage. You think you see something, but it's just the white cap of a wave off in the distance. Around an hour and a half in, I believe, we realized they couldn't be down there anymore. We had to make the decision to pull anchor and drive around looking. Even though we had the coordinates, pulling anchor is a really shitty feeling. It happens slow and makes you feel like you're leaving someone behind. So we drove around, with people hanging from the sides of the boat trying to get the highest visual vantage to see something. Nothing. Time to call this in. We radioed the Coast Guard and gave them those important details. It's been about 2 to 2.5 hours when we see the Coast Guard boats in the distance coming toward us from down the coast. It's about 5 miles out. One boat slows and circles, the other heads back to shore. We think they've found our guys. Finally, the Coast Guard boat approaches us, and as it swings over, we see our divers alive and healthy, although mildly shaken up. It turns out they spent a total of 15 to 30 minutes trying to get down, but the bottom side current was so bad they called off the dive. When they came up, they were roughly 3 miles away from us. They spent nearly 3 hours topside, where they could see us in the distance, but we couldn't see them. One guy freaked out a bit as the currents took them further out over time. There was a plan that maybe they should swim to Miami Beach, but that's scary enough on its own. We believe the Coast Guard was able to triangulate a position based on local currents, and the information we gave them. This all could have been avoided if our divers had a whistle or inflatable signal. We spent the rest of the night at the bar telling that story.